He was the man who could end a dream with a single word, the king of brutal honesty who built an empire on the backs of pop stars. But at 65, the man who once seemed invincible is facing a reality far harsher than any critique he ever delivered. Behind the designer suits and the smug smile lies a life scarred by health scares, public humiliations, and a devastating tragedy that has forced the ultimate music mogul to confront his own mortality. The tragedy of Simon Cowell isn't just about aging, it's about a man who can no longer outrun the consequences of his own life. Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story? The man who once told aspiring singers they had no chance found himself facing his own mortality in the most mundane way possible, a cup of hot milk. In October 2017, Simon Cowell was rushed from his London home wearing a neck brace, stretchered out by paramedics after fainting and tumbling down the stairs. He had been feeling unwell, gone to get warm milk, and on the way back upstairs, everything went black. The next thing he remembered was waking up with paramedics surrounding him and a searing headache from where he'd hit the staircase. The diagnosis? Low blood pressure, a condition that exposed the alarming truth that the man who worked until 8 a.m. every day, who called himself a vampire with a relentless schedule, was not invincible after all. For the first time, Simon Cowell admitted he was vulnerable. Doctors told him he was very lucky the fall hadn't been more serious. But just 3 years later, luck would run out again, and this time, the price would be far higher. It was a moment that should have been triumphant. In August 2020, Simon Cowell was testing a new electric bike at his Malibu estate. A man who had never been an athlete was trying to stay active, embracing a healthier lifestyle after a wake-up call years earlier. But in a split second, that bike threw him over the handlebars. He crashed to the ground and shattered his back, breaking it in multiple places. The man who spent decades at the judge's table, critiquing every move of others, suddenly found himself unable to walk. He was flown to the hospital for emergency surgery that lasted 6 hours, and a metal rod was inserted into his spine. But it was the recovery that truly broke him. Forced to lie still for weeks, dependent on nurses and loved ones, Simon Cowell was stripped of everything that defined him: control, power, and above all, the relentless work ethic that made him a billionaire. For the first time in his life, he couldn't run the show. He couldn't call into meetings. He couldn't micromanage. The man who prided himself on being in the room where decisions were made was left alone in a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling. And in that silence, something else began to surface, something far more painful than a broken back. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. It wasn't the broken back that nearly broke him. It was the silence that followed. In the stillness of his recovery, Simon Cowell found himself alone with memories he had spent decades running from, and the weight of 2 losses he still couldn't fully process. The first came in 1999. Simon was celebrating Westlife hitting #1 in the charts for the first time. It should have been the happiest day of his professional life. Instead, it became the worst day of his personal one. He called his mother to share the news, thrilled, buzzing with excitement. She didn't tell him. She couldn't bear to. His father, Eric, had suffered a massive heart attack at home that same day. He had died at age 81. The devastating news was left to Simon's younger brother to deliver. Simon once admitted he would have swapped all my success to keep him around. His father had been his mentor, the man who gave him his first break, landing Simon a job in the EMI mailroom. Eric was the one who taught him the advice Simon still carries: everyone around you has an invisible sign on their head that says, "Make me feel important." That wisdom shaped the empire Simon built, but the man who taught it never got to see his son become a global television icon. Eric died before Simon ever sat behind a judge's table. Then came 2015. Simon's mother, Julie, died at age 89 following a stroke. She had been his anchor, the one woman who could reduce him to a 5-year-old with a single phone call. When she passed, Simon was forced to cancel the first round of X Factor auditions. He described the 9 months of watching her decline as 9 months of hell. But here's the cruel twist: Simon had become a father just a year earlier, in 2014, when his son Eric was born. His mother got to meet the boy. She even bought him a brown blanket that Eric still treasures to this day. But she didn't live long enough to see him grow up. Now, recovering from a shattered back in that Malibu hospital bed, Simon Cowell was forced to confront the truth he had been avoiding for years. He was, in his own words, lost. Both his parents were gone. The love that had defined his life felt like it had vanished. For the first time, the man who had everything realized he had lost the only things that truly mattered. But that loss, as devastating as it was, had planted a seed of something else, something that would eventually force him to re-evaluate every choice he had ever made. He had finally slowed down, and in that stillness, the question haunted him: what had he been chasing all those years, and what had he sacrificed along the way? If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. He was lying in that hospital bed, his back held together by a metal rod, unable to move, unable to work. And for the first time in his life, Simon Cowell had no choice but to stop. That stillness was agony, until a small voice pulled him back from the edge. In 2020, Eric was 6 years old. The boy who shared Simon's father's name became his reason to fight through the pain. Simon later admitted he couldn't have got through it without the support of Lauren and Eric. The accident had stolen his independence, but it gave him something far more valuable: presence. It was a brutal irony. Simon had spent his entire adulthood running away from stillness, filling every hour with work, with meetings, with the roar of arenas and the drama of television. He admitted he was a vampire, working until 7 a.m. and waking up at 2 p.m. The schedule was so punishing that he once collapsed from nervous exhaustion. After his mother died in 2015, he threw himself into work with even greater desperation. "I'm just going to be a ridiculous workaholic," he confessed. "I was very successful, but I wasn't happy. I really wasn't happy." But in 2014, something had shifted. Simon's son Eric was born, named after the father he had lost 15 years earlier. The boy who carried his grandfather's name became the key to unlocking something Simon had buried deep. He admitted that becoming a father, without question, saved him. "When I got the call from Lauren," he recalled, "it changed everything in my life. It made me happy again." His mother Julie got to meet baby Eric. She held him, bought him a brown blanket, and saw the name her late husband had passed on. She died the following year, but she had seen the cycle continue. Now, in that Malibu recovery room, Eric was there every day. Simon watched his son play, heard him laugh, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. "It's how I feel for Eric," Simon later said. "Just that pure love. Everything starts to come full circle." The grief that had driven him to work himself into collapse was slowly being replaced by something far more powerful. But the public saw none of this. The cameras captured a man who had fallen from a bike, had a dramatic surgery, and returned to television. The real story was unfolding behind closed doors, away from the spotlight. Simon Cowell was learning to be still, and in that stillness, he was finally confronting the question he had been running from for decades. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. The man who had spent decades running from stillness had finally stopped, and in that stop, he found something he never expected: peace. Simon Cowell emerged from his recovery a different person. The workaholic who once bragged about working until 8 a.m. was gone. In his place stood a father who had learned to say no to the relentless demands of his empire. Fatherhood had changed him, he admitted, and it had saved him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. "You realize that there are other things more important, actually, than your career," he confessed. It was a stunning admission from a man whose entire identity had been built on chasing the next hit, the next show, the next billion-dollar deal. But the transformation ran deeper than just a lighter schedule. Simon began to speak openly about the depression that had consumed him after his mother's death. He admitted that during those dark years, he had reached a point where he didn't care if he lived or died. He had thrown himself into work, gained weight, and retreated into a vampire-like existence where night and day blurred together. "I was on a downward spiral," he confessed. "I lost everyone, you know. I've lost my parents. It's finality now. Everything just meant nothing at that point." The man who had judged millions of performers on live television was performing himself, hiding his devastation behind a judge's smirk while feeling like he was dying inside. Then came the moment that rewired his entire existence. He saw the scan of his unborn son, and something shifted. Eric became his therapy, his reason to get out of bed, to eat properly, to care again. The boy named after Simon's father brought back the love Simon thought he had lost forever. Because that love comes back 100 times more powerful, he said. I mean, it's extraordinary and it never goes. He even started to believe his parents were still with him, that his mother's spirit lived on in the brown blanket she had bought for Eric, and that his father's wisdom still guided him when he asked, "What would you do?" But just as Simon was learning to embrace this new chapter, life delivered its most unexpected twist yet, one that would force him to confront his own mortality in a way he had never imagined. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week.